All right, let's dive right into the multi-layered realities driving the most serious conflict in Europe since World War II. When you step back from the chaotic day-to-day headlines, you actually find these deeply rooted, undeniable forces at play. In this explainer, we're going to bypass the noise and examine the cold, calculating mechanics driving this crisis by breaking down the data and historical realities.
It's the absolute biggest question on everybody's mind, right? What exactly does Russia want with Ukraine? Well, rather than looking for a simple, one-word answer, we really need to objectively analyze Moscow's strategic motives across a few distinct, very calculating domains. The origins of what's happening today are actually rooted in the collapse of the Soviet Union more than 3 decades ago. So, to really understand the present, we have to look at the geography and economics that shaped the aftermath. To do that, we'll be following this roadmap for our explainer today. We'll cover the geographic buffer zone, Europe's powerful petrostate, the Ukrainian energy threat, water and demographics, and finally, the Georgia playbook. Let's peel back the layers of this conflict, looking exclusively through the lens of geopolitics, resource economics, and demographic pressure.
Okay, starting with Section 1, the geographic buffer zone, or defending the flatlands. Let's see how geography dictates Moscow's deep-seated security and anxieties.
Look, any regime sitting in Moscow, and I don't care what era or ideology we're talking about, feels geographically vulnerable. And the reason is the North European plain. It's a massive, totally flat geographic expanse that basically acts like a giant funnel. It's really narrow in northern Germany, but as you move east towards the Ural Mountains in Russia, the mouth of this funnel opens up incredibly wide. Because it's almost entirely open and flat, this vast terrain is historically just incredibly difficult to defend across its entire length.
Just contrast the highly defensible borders of the past with Moscow's current reality. Back during the Cold War, the Soviet front lines were narrow and relatively easy to hold. But today, it's a completely different story. The former Warsaw Pact countries and Baltic states have joined NATO. If Ukraine were to join NATO as well, it would push those front lines far across the absolute widest section of that funnel. Moscow would suddenly be looking at nearly 2,300 kilometers of open, hard-to-defend, flat land. And the easternmost edge of that line, it would be a mere 300 kilometers from cutting off the vital Volga River, which would completely sever their access to valuable resources.
Moving right along to Section 2, Europe's powerful petrostate, the economic foundation. Let's examine the literal foundation of modern Russian power, which is energy.
Here's the crucial point you have to keep in mind. Russia operates as a massive European petrostate. They possess the world's largest proven reserves of natural gas, and they're the second largest producer of oil. The revenues they pull in from selling these exports fund a staggering 50% of the entire Russian government's budget, and it makes up about 30% of their entire GDP. That's the money that pays for their military, clears their debts, and effectively finances their status as a global power.
And to really grasp Moscow's leverage, you have to look at who's buying all that energy. 35% of the European Union's entire natural gas supply originates from Russia. Germany alone imports nearly half of its natural gas from them. It creates this massive mutual dependency. Europe desperately needs the gas to keep the lights and heat on, and Russia absolutely needs that revenue flowing in. Historically, a huge chunk of these gas pipelines ran like a direct bridge straight through Ukraine.
Which perfectly sets up Section 3, the Ukrainian energy threat. A rival emerges. This brings us to a huge shift in 2012 that threatened to completely upend Russia's energy monopoly in Europe.
The scale of this threat from Moscow's perspective was absolutely massive. Back in 2012, more than 2 trillion cubic meters of gas were discovered in Ukraine's Black Sea waters, mostly right around the Crimean Peninsula. At the exact same time, new technology was unlocking massive shale gas hotspots in eastern Ukraine around Donetsk and Kharkiv. Almost overnight, Ukraine was suddenly poised to hold the world's 14th largest gas reserves. And when the Ukrainian government started granting drilling rights to Western heavyweights like Shell and Exxon, well, Ukraine was suddenly on the verge of becoming Europe's second petrostate, a direct, massive rival to Russia.
You really have to watch how rapidly this timeline escalates. Back in 2012, when these discoveries were made, Ukraine had a pro-Russian president. So for Moscow, the threat was kept in check. But fast forward to February 2014, and that government falls in a pro-Western revolution. Very shortly after the government in Kyiv collapsed, Russia invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula.
When you factor in the resources, the motivation becomes crystal clear. By annexing Crimea, Russia didn't just take land. They literally seized 2/3 of Ukraine's coastline.
And in doing so, they took direct control of an estimated 80% of Ukraine's potential offshore oil and gas reserves. Naturally, Shell and Exxon immediately backed out of their contracts. This single strategic move successfully kneecapped Ukraine's ability to extract those resources, completely neutralizing them as a rival and protecting the Kremlin's primary source of wealth.
But holding territory creates its own vulnerabilities. That brings us to Section 4, Water and Demographics, the pressure of time.
85%. That is a staggering number. That's the percentage of Crimea's freshwater supply that Ukraine deliberately blocked. Geography dictates that Crimea is essentially an island, mostly covered in dry steppes. Before the annexation, it completely relied on the Soviet-era canal connected to the Dnieper River for water. But after 2014, Ukraine quite literally filled the canal with cement within their borders. Just like that, they cut off 85% of the water supply to Russian-occupied Crimea.
The ecological and economic impact of that was devastating. Crimea literally started dying a death from 1,000 cuts. The region's climate shifted, and 2020 actually became the driest year in 150 years of record-keeping. The capital city's reservoir plummeted to less than 7% capacity. With Moscow bleeding billions of dollars annually just trying to ship in fresh water, freeing up this canal became a massive, urgent geographical pressure point.
And while they're fighting for water, Moscow is fighting another ruthless enemy, time itself. 25 million. That is the current and rapidly shrinking pool of military-age men in Russia. Look, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's deaths have outpaced its births. Worsened by the pandemic, Russia is now undergoing its largest peacetime demographic decline in all of recorded history. The government knows this pool of manpower is only getting smaller. The math here is brutal. The longer Russia waits to secure its borders, the harder it'll be to find the men to actually do it.
So how do these pressures turn into military action? Section 5, the Georgia Playbook, historical precedent. We just have to look at how Moscow has acted in the past.
Because if you want to know what they're doing today, the strategy is practically a carbon copy of the playbook used to dismember Georgia 14 years prior. Look at the steps. Step 1, recognize 2 pro-Russian breakaway provinces as independent. In Georgia, it was Abkhazia in South Ossetia. In Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. Step 2, deploy troops into those regions under the convenient guise of peacekeepers. Step 3, launch a full-scale, wider invasion right from those footholds. The ultimate result back in 2008 was successfully blocking Georgia from ever joining NATO, and the current playbook in Ukraine is aiming for that exact same strategic outcome.
You don't even have to guess at their intent, because they laid it out in their demands right before the 2022 invasion. Moscow explicitly demanded that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO. They demanded that NATO withdraw forces in Eastern Europe all the way back to their pre-1997 boundaries, and they demanded a complete freeze on any future NATO expansion. Now, obviously, the West universally rejected these terms, but the demands themselves explicitly lay bare Russia's ultimate goal, re-establishing a vast geographic security buffer across that flat European plain.
So what's the big takeaway from all this data? The source material for this explainer actually sums it up perfectly. Through the lenses of geographic security, the economics of oil and gas, the changing climate, the shortage of water, and internal demographic crisis, it's clear to see what Russia's primary concerns are. When you strip away the chaotic daily headlines, you're left with the cold, hard calculations of a state acting to secure its borders, protect its vital petroeconomy, and ensure its survival against some really severe internal and external pressures.
Which leaves us with a really profound question to chew on. Even now, in our highly advanced 21st century, are modern wars still ultimately dictated by ancient geography, hidden resources, and harsh climate realities? I'm going to leave you with that thought to ponder, as we continue to watch these unstoppable geopolitical forces reshape the map of our modern world. Thanks for tuning into this explainer.